Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thanks everyone. My name's Charles Leyland. I'm Managing Director of Leyland Private Asset Management. We're a boutique wealth management firm. We run a lot of discretionary equity accounts, and we're very proud to be associated with the British Chamber of Commerce. We find that they run excellent events such as this. Firstly, I'd like to thank Helen and Fred and their team for putting on such a wonderful lunch. The Chamber does run a lot of events throughout the year. They bring together like-minded people. We have good discussion about events. Some functions are more serious, some are a bit more casual. One of the pervading themes of every function, though, seems to be the sporting rivalry between Australia and England. The Australians were reminded of this ad nauseum during the Olympics when the tally count was regaled to us by the Englishmen. But the English fraternity have gone a little bit quiet this week after the Wallabies managed to give the English rugby team a touch-up at Twickenham on the weekend. At Leyland, we jumped at the opportunity to sponsor this event. I was fortunate enough to meet Mike Smith twice since he's joined ANZ. The first time was in 2008, in the middle of the GFC, and ANZ shares had fallen from $32 to $16, and fortunately we didn't own any, but we were buying them, and I was sort of gleefully regaling why we thought his business was such a good investment and how smart we were, and Mike candidly said, well, words to the effect of, your logic's right, but I can't guarantee they won't halve again. And so I appreciated that candour, because a lot of people miss that disconnect that a good business can actually trade at ridiculously low prices and then halve again from those ridiculously low prices. So, obviously you're dealing with a man who understands that disconnect. That really comes down to the irrational markets which we've seen over the last few years, and we're still seeing in a lot of businesses. But irrational markets are the reason we exist. Warren Buffett's got a famous quote where he said, if markets were rational, he'd be a bum sitting on the street with a tin cup in his hand. The second time I met Mike Smith was at the Hong Kong Sevens last year on the eve of the Sevens, and when he discussed with me how much he enjoys going to the Hong Kong Sevens, I realised that he's a man after my own heart. Mr. Smith is a formidable character in the international banking scene. Prior to joining ANZ in 2007, he was the Chief Executive Officer of HSBC in Hong Kong. He was Chairman of the Hang Seng Bank, Global Head of Commercial Banking for HSBC, and Chairman of the HSBC Bank Malaysia Berhad. Previously, CEO of HSBC Argentina, and was then appointed to the Chairman of HSBC Argentina in 2000. I understand those were very interesting times. Mr. Smith's Chairman of the Bankers Association, a member of the Business Council of Australia and the Asian Business Council. He's a director of both the Financial Markets Foundation for Children and the Financial Literacy Advisory Board. Mr. Smith was made an Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2000 and a Chevalier de l'Ordre du Mérite Agricole in 2007. As fund managers and investors in ANZ, on behalf of our clients, we're very interested in the ANZ Asian story. We think, given Mr. Smith's exposure there in the past and the opportunities available there, he's obviously got a good insight into that, and that should hopefully tie in well on this speech on the Asian century. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Mr. Smith to the forum.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for those very kind words, Charles. I hope you bought quite a lot of those shares, because you'd have done very well. Let me start by thanking David and the Chamber for the opportunity to speak to you today. The last time actually I addressed this forum was early in 2008. Actually just before the financial crisis really rolled over these shores. And then I spoke about Asia and it's something that I'd like to continue with today. Asia, of course, is actually the opportunity that brought me back to Australia, and it's the opportunity that I passionately believe as the driver of the transformation that we're undertaking at ANZ. But it's also the driver of a very different and, I think, a much more prosperous future for Australia. Today, though, my task is not to present a lecture, which I probably did in 2008. I think it's all now much more clearly understood that Asia's importance to the future of Australian business, and indeed the whole Australian economy, is a given. Today, the aim of my address is really to advance a conversation with you. A conversation about the state of the Australian economy, about how we need to think about the opportunities that Asia presents, and about facing up to the significant challenge that the Asian century poses. First, though, I have to say that I'm incredibly pleased that this conversation has now become a national one. And that is the result of the release of the government's white paper on the Asian century, and it's now one that has genuine engagement of our political leadership. I believe, however, that the white paper gives us the opportunity to address some of the really difficult issues that we face in adapting our economy and our businesses in this Asian century. The starting point for our conversation, of course, is not here in Australia. It's actually the extraordinary rise of China over the past decade, and increasingly in other major economies in the region, in India, in Indonesia, and in Vietnam. Today, the emerging economies account for more than 2/3 of global growth, half of which comes from China alone. In Australia, we are seeing both the opportunities and the challenges of this game changer playing out. Fundamentally, our growth is now being driven by the urbanisation and the industrialisation of Asia. And our prosperity is being underpinned by a super cycle in mining and energy, and increasingly in agriculture. To understand the scale of this cycle, the research that we have conducted in ANZ estimates that the investment opportunity in the natural resources sector could be as high as $1.8 trillion over the next 20 years. In agriculture, which I believe to be the next sector to really experience significant Asia-led growth, a further $1 trillion of capital could be required. So it's now increasingly clear that what we're seeing in Australia is not a normal or routine commodities boom. It's the result of a far more fundamental shift in the global economy as growth has shifted to Asia. And it's a shift which, frankly, has many decades to run. However, as China puts in place deliberate policy measures to slow economic growth from around or from above 10% per annum to a more sustainable level of 7 to 8%, it's also clear that the one-off factors associated with this phase of the resource boom, including the incredibly favourable terms of trade and the initial investment surge, have masked weakening fundamentals in our economy. Today, although most of the first-generation resources projects are still going to be built, our research highlights that up to 2/3 of projects that have been on the drawing board are clearly not going to make it in the foreseeable future. The cost, the completion, and relative return risks are simply too high, and there is a flight to quality. At the same time, the high Aussie dollar, now fueled by a newfound status as a safe haven currency, is seeing some sectors, such as manufacturing and tourism, experience enormous pressure. If there's a common theme here, it's that Australia's productivity performance over the past decade has been weaker than at any time in the past 30 years. With commodity prices easing and global demand softening, at least in the short term, we have to urgently address Australia's slide in productivity, both to maximise the long-term opportunity in natural resources and in agriculture, but also to create a softer landing for our trade-exposed industries like manufacturing. Just to highlight how important the productivity challenge is, a recent study by McKinsey set out a scenario where if the terms of trade move back towards their long-term average, and if some capital projects stall, and if productivity growth remains low, under this scenario, we could see income growth stagnate at about 0.5% per annum until 2017. While McKinsey described this as the worst-case scenario when their study was published in August, what we are seeing at the moment highlights the need to take meaningful action to restart productivity growth. To see this properly, we have to be honest with ourselves. And when we talk about the performance of the Australian economy, and we have to move on from the sense of complacency which exists in part of the community. Let me say, however, that this sense of complacency isn't just an issue for Australia. But what is clear to varying degrees across the developed economies of the West is that we have retreated from a culture of innovation and aspiration that characterised much of the 19th and 20th century towards one of regulation and, frankly, unrealistic entitlement that is increasingly defining segments of the global economy. Now, this plain speaking isn't terribly popular in certain circles, but unless we are willing to engage in a more challenging and difficult conversation about our future, I believe we will struggle to grasp the enormous opportunity that we have in the Asian century and our ability to manage the increasing headwinds that we face. When the June national accounts were released in September, showing GDP growing at almost 4%, the wisdom in some quarters was that, yeah, things are slowing down, but we're still a world beater. On the face of it, that's true. But when you look at the state numbers in those same accounts, they paint a more challenging picture, certainly of a more multi-speed or patchwork economy, which is actually in significant transition. In the resource estates of Western Australia and Queensland, annualised growth in demand was around 16% and 8% respectively, driven largely by business investment in mining and energy. In the Northern Territory, annual growth was more than 30%, driven by the construction phase of some of the LNG projects. In the non-mining states, where much of our population lives, demand is actually sluggish and trend actually growing at less than, well, between 2% and 3%. So, obviously the future opportunity for Australia, which was described by Glenn Stevens last year as potentially the recipient of, and I quote his quote, "the biggest gift the global economy has handed Australia since the gold rush of the 1950s, is in fact no cakewalk." Indeed, this sort of gift is turning out to be very, very complex. I believe that if we are to have an honest appreciation of the situation, then at every level, in our companies, amongst our policymakers, and in the broader community, we're going to have to bring much bolder thinking on how we're going to transform our economy and our society and truly grasp the opportunities we have. Above all, managing through times like these require a long-term understanding and articulation of the national interests by both businesses, our unions, the community at large, and of course by government. And let me also say, and it doesn't sound like it, but this is a glass half full perspective. And frankly, I have a loan book of $500 billion, so I hope it is an optimistic evaluation. It is certainly an optimistic opportunity. And I think there's much to applaud in the white paper and in the Prime Minister's goal to see Australia as a winner in the Asian century. But it's also worth remembering that in a number of areas we have been actively turning our backs to the opportunity in Asia, and there are some unfortunate losers. The treatment of the live cattle trade is a glaring example. Years of industry development were overturned overnight, with exports curtailed, and now we wonder why Indonesia wants to be self-sufficient in beef. Why should we entertain the idea of restricting the supply of temporary overseas construction workers when we know that the lack of skilled workers is making our projects uncompetitive and in some cases unable to be built at all? I might add here that the proposal in recent days for an Indonesian guest worker program is welcome recognition by the government that labour shortages in parts of Australia are undermining economic growth. But these are all straws in the wind, individually, but taken together, the frequency and the nature of these issues tell me it's actually going to be difficult for Australia to truly take advantage of this Asian century. So a national conversation about how we take advantage of the opportunities is essential in providing us a clear way forward. And that conversation is overdue. There are obvious areas where we need to start. Our project costs have ballooned out of all proportion. Foreign exchange costs have not helped, but at the root of it are the uncompetitive construction costs and site deals. This isn't just a question of lost capital expenditure. There is a loss in ongoing mine revenue, in ongoing taxes, and in ongoing employment. Earlier, I spoke about the massive capital needs Australia has to support growth. In our resources and agricultural industries alone, as I said earlier, this could amount to almost $3 trillion over the next 20 years, if those sectors are to reach their full potential. How we access that capital is another vital conversation, because Australia's capital requirements are very large in a world where capital is an increasingly scarce resource. Australia is a net importer of capital, and historically our growth has been driven by foreign investors. Think of our wool industry in the 19th century, our cotton industry in the 1960s. However, the nature of the recent debate over farm and agricultural land ownership highlights this is a reality that some parts of the Australian community have found challenging, and to which we are adjusting only slowly. This is the time for us in business to help lead a better informed debate about how we reduce sovereign risk and increase capital flows from Asia, which are likely to be the countries with the most available funds. Another area where we need a more active conversation is how we create more flexibility in labour markets. For example, by building new workforce skills, accommodating a range of business models, and increasing the supply of skilled labour to support growth opportunities, particularly those in remote areas. And as I said earlier, productivity growth in our economy has been stalling. We clearly need to be doing more to increase investment in growth-enabling infrastructure, to increase and refocus our national R&D effort, and to ensure that our education system supports the participation in the Asian century. In closing, I want to say again that I strongly believe that in order to take advantage of the opportunities we have as a nation, we need to move beyond sound bites and really have a real discussion about the fundamental challenges we face in maximising those opportunities and in managing their implications. As business leaders, we need to use the roadmap that has been created by the Asian Century White Paper to both lead the national conversation about genuine reforms that will create a more flexible economy, so Australia makes its own luck in the Asian century, just as we have done in the past. Many thanks for the opportunity to start that conversation with you today, and I look forward to our discussion. Many thanks indeed.
Mike's agreed to take a few questions.